December 1941. The world holds its breath. At the gates of Moscow, time itself seems to have frozen. The earth, hard as steel, stretches out in an infinite white mantle beneath a leaden sky. Here, at the edge of existence, the Wehrmacht's Army Group Center, the most formidable fighting force history has ever known, lies paralyzed. Lieutenant Fritz Hanne, of the 2nd Panzer Army, can no longer feel his toes. They have become useless lumps of wood at the end of his legs. Through the fogged lens of his binoculars, he thinks he can make out the distant glint of the Kremlin's golden domes. Only 8 kilometers. A laughable distance. A cruel joke. His men, wrapped in rags and stolen blankets, look like specters. Their summer uniforms, designed for a victory parade in Red Square, are now shrouds of ice. The grease in their machine guns has solidified. The engine oil in their tanks is a useless paste. Every dawn is a battle not against the Red Army, but against the thermometer. The cold is an invisible predator. It bites at exposed flesh, slips under clothing, and gnaws at the bones. Sentries freeze to death at their posts, turned into ice statues with their eyes wide open, fixed on the eastern horizon. The wounded groan in makeshift tents, their battle wounds eclipsed by the black gangrene of frostbite. Food is a distant memory. A piece of rock-hard bread, a sip of watery soup that freezes before it reaches the throat. The horses, emaciated and trembling, fall one by one, their stringy meat a feast that barely delays the inevitable. Dysentery ravages the ranks, a final humiliation in this white hell. Yet a strange confidence persists, a feverish delusion born of months of unstoppable victories. The high command in Berlin assures them it is just a pause. General Winter, an unexpected ally for the Russians, has granted a brief respite to an already defeated enemy. The Red Army, the dispatches insist, is finished. There are no reserves left. In the letters that manage to leave this frozen wasteland, the soldiers write of the imminent victory. They tell their families they will soon be marching through the streets of Moscow, that the war will be over before Christmas. It is a lie they whisper to one another around weak bonfires, fed with the remains of Russian peasant homes. But in the endless nights, when the wind howls like a lost soul through the forests of naked birch trees, doubt creeps into their hearts. They feel the weight of the steppe, the immensity of a land that seems to swallow entire armies. They hear an unnatural silence, a watchful stillness. They do not know they are not on the threshold of victory. They are on the edge of an abyss. They are not besieging Moscow. They are caught in a frozen trap, and the jaws of that trap are about to slam shut with a violence that will shake the world. Hell, as one soldier would write, was only just beginning. To understand the catastrophe that was about to unfold, we must go back a few weeks, to the war maps in the German headquarters. There, the reality of mud and snow was nothing more than a colored line on a map. The plan, christened with the arrogance of a power that believed itself divine, was Operation Typhoon. The concept was the quintessence of the Blitzkrieg, a masterpiece of tactical audacity. 2 colossal steel pincers, formed by the panzer armies of Guderian and Hoth, would close east of Moscow, trapping the capital and its last defenders in a pocket of annihilation. It would be the finishing blow, the final Kesselschlacht that would decapitate the Soviet state. At the head of Army Group Center was Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, a Prussian aristocrat, methodical and professional to the core. He saw the harshness of the weather, felt the exhaustion of his men, and noted the fragility of his supply lines. But even his caution was swept away by the tide of optimism emanating from the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia. German intelligence, the Abwehr, had been categorical. After the monumental victories at Kiev and Vyazma, where over 1 million Soviet soldiers had been taken prisoner, the Red Army simply had no more strategic reserves. It was a logical conclusion, based on every Western war manual. No nation could withstand such losses and continue to fight. The main driver of this last desperate push was Heinz Guderian, the father of the panzer forces. For Guderian to stop was anathema. A man of action, impatient and brilliant, he saw the Soviet resistance as the final convulsion of a dying body. He pushed relentlessly, arguing that one last effort would break the enemy's will. The mindset of the German high command was a toxic cocktail of success and prejudice. Months of lightning victories had created an aura of invincibility. They believed their own propaganda. The German soldier was an Übermensch, and the Slav, a subhuman incapable of organized resistance or complex strategic planning. They catastrophically underestimated Soviet resilience. They could not conceive that, as they advanced, a state they considered primitive was evacuating entire industries beyond the Urals. They could not imagine that, in the vast interior of Siberia, completely new armies were being formed, equipped and trained for winter. They saw the defense of Moscow not as a coherent strategy, but as the irrational fanaticism of a collapsing regime. Every Russian soldier who died defending his post was, to them, further proof that the enemy was expending its last forces. They were blind to the truth. This blindness was not merely tactical, it was ideological. They could not accept that the enemy they despised could be capable of strategic deception on such a massive scale. They were fighting the ghosts of their own past victories, convinced that history would repeat itself once more. So, as the panzer engines coughed and died in the cold, the generals looked at their maps and saw the encirclement nearly complete. They believed they were about to deliver the final blow to a bloodless enemy. They did not know that the enemy was not dying. It was waiting, watching in silence from the heart of the snowstorm, under the cold, calculating gaze of a man named Georgy Zhukov. There was no formal ultimatum, no messenger with a white flag demanding surrender. The real challenge came not from a man, but from the planet itself. The Wehrmacht's paralysis was not a tactical pause, it was a systemic collapse. The earth, first with the mud of the Rasputitsa, and then with the mortal embrace of ice, had stopped the greatest war machine ever created dead in its tracks. And in that forced silence, in that unnatural stillness, Georgy Zhukov saw his opportunity. Inside the Kremlin, the atmosphere was thick with tobacco smoke and contained desperation. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, paced back and forth like a caged animal. His generals had brought him grim reports for weeks. Moscow was on the brink of the abyss. But now, Zhukov, the butcher of Leningrad, the man summoned to perform a miracle, stood before him with a dangerous light in his eyes. It was not optimism. Zhukov did not know that emotion. It was the cold, predatory certainty of a hunter who sees his prey, powerful but wounded, stumble and fall in the snow. While others saw Army Group Center as a beast ready for one last or fatal strike, Zhukov saw something different. He saw a giant of steel with feet of ice. His argument before Stalin and the Defense Committee, the Stavka, was brutally simple. The Germans were overextended. Their supply lines, stretching 1,000 kilometers across hostile territory, were a thread about to snap. Their men were freezing, their equipment was failing, and their arrogance had blinded them. He convinced a deeply skeptical Stalin that this was the moment, the only moment, to unleash the Soviet Union's best-kept secret, the strategic reserves. Entire armies, secretly formed in the heart of Siberia and the Far East, were hidden in the forests east of Moscow. They were elite divisions, equipped with winter uniforms, trained for extreme cold, and led by men who considered 30 degrees below zero to be invigorating weather. Zhukov's plan was a perverse inversion of the Blitzkrieg. He would not attack the panzer spearheads, where the Germans were still strong. He would strike the flanks, the weak junctions between the infantry armies and the armored corps. He would use the speed and endurance of his Siberian ski troops to infiltrate behind enemy lines, sowing chaos in their rear. And then, he would unleash the beast, hundreds of T-34 tanks, whose wide tracks glided over the snow and whose diesel engines roared to life in the cold that killed the panzers. Stalin, looking at his general's impassive face, a peasant's face carved by hardship, made the decision that would save his nation. He gave the green light. The order was transmitted in a whisper through field wires buried beneath the snow. In the snow-covered forests, a force of over 1 million men, a ghost army that German intelligence swore did not exist, began to move. The decision was made. The die was cast. In the stillness of the night, tank crews made their final checks. The Siberian infantry, clad in their white camouflage, melted into the landscape, becoming avenging specters. The coming clash would not be just a battle. It would be an act of retribution on a continental scale. How Zhukov unleashed this frozen hell upon an unsuspecting enemy is a lesson in military genius and brutality. To witness how this secret army shattered the myth of German invincibility in the first 24 hours, be sure to subscribe to our channel and like this video. The storm is about to break, and the detailed analysis that follows will reveal every crucial moment. Now, 0 hour approaches on the Moscow front, December 5th, 3 in the morning. The temperature has dropped to 25 degrees below zero. In the German trenches, an absolute silence reigns over a world of frost. It is the deep, brittle silence of the Arctic winter, a silence the soldiers have come to fear more than any noise. Then, the world tore itself apart. Without warning, 1,000 kilometers of front erupted into an inferno of fire and steel. From the Kalinin front to the north, thousands of Soviet cannons opened fire in unison. Night turned into day, an artificial, apocalyptic dawn of orange flashes dancing on the horizon. The earth, frozen a meter deep, trembled as if the planet itself were in convulsions. For the German soldier Hans Richter, huddled in his foxhole, the sound was not an explosion but the end of existence. It was a continuous thunder, a roar that was not just heard but felt in the chest, in the teeth, in the soul. Then came the howl, a supernatural shriek, like 1,000 derailing trains at once, rising and falling on a demented scale. It was Stalin's organs, the Katyusha rocket launchers. Volleys of rockets slammed into the German lines, turning defensive positions into smoking craters. Century-old trees snapped like matchsticks. Makeshift bunkers disintegrated. Men who a second before were in a frozen sleep simply ceased to exist, vaporized in a storm of red-hot shrapnel. And from that firestorm, the phantoms emerged. From the snow-covered forests, white-clad figures appeared. They did not run. They advanced at a swift, relentless pace, making almost no sound. They were the Siberian divisions. To the terrified German defenders, their retinas still burning from the artillery flashes, they looked like apparitions, snow demons come to collect a blood debt. The MG-34 machine guns, Hitler's saws, refused to fire. The cold had frozen their mechanisms, rifles jammed. The men, their fingers numb and useless, fumbled with their weapons, their movements slow and desperate. The Siberians did not hesitate. They fired their SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles, advanced with fixed bayonets, and threw grenades with lethal precision. On December 6th, the hell expanded. Zhukov's western front, directly before Moscow, joined the assault, and with it came the T-34. Sergeant Dmitry Volkov, commander of a T-34 in the 1st Shock Army, felt the vibration of the diesel engine through the floor plate. Outside, the blizzard raged. But inside his 30-ton steel beast, the world was noise, the smell of fuel, and a frigid determination. His order was simple: advance. His tank emerged from the tree line, its wide tracks crushing the deep snow that had been a tomb for the panzers. Siberian infantry moved alongside, using the tank's hull as a mobile shield. Ahead, a German PK-38 anti-tank gun crew struggled frantically to aim their weapon. The German cannon spat fire. The 50mm shell streaked across the snowy field and struck the sloped frontal armor of Dmitry's T-34. The impact sounded like a colossal hammer blow inside the tank, showering the crew with flecks of paint and metal. But the shell, unable to penetrate the ingenious armor design, ricocheted harmlessly into the gray sky. Dmitry's response was instant. His gunner already had the German cannon in his sights. The T-34's turret whined as it turned. The 76mm cannon roared, and the high-explosive shell obliterated the PK-38 and its crew in a ball of fire and blackened snow. There was no duel. It was an execution. All along the front, similar scenes were repeated. The T-34s, immune to the cold that had paralyzed the panzers, led the assault. They were steel battering rams that crushed, overran, and destroyed everything in their path. The German defenses, designed to stop infantry, were useless against them. The surprise was total. The German High Command, which hours earlier had been discussing plans for the final assault on Moscow, was now receiving incoherent and desperate reports of a massive attack by forces that, according to their own intelligence, did not exist. Communication lines were cut. Units disintegrated. As the front collapsed, Zhukov's tactics were revealed in all their diabolical brilliance. Siberian ski units, moving at incredible speed through the forests, slipped through the gaps in the German lines. They bypassed strong points and fell like wolves upon the rear echelons. They attacked divisional headquarters, blew up ammunition dumps, and ambushed supply convoys. One German officer, writing in his diary, described the terror of being attacked from all directions at once. The front was no longer a line, but a bloody chaos. In the first 48 hours, Army Group Center, the pride of the Wehrmacht, ceased to be an offensive force. It became a terrified mob fighting for survival. The retreat began, not as an orderly maneuver, but as a desperate flight. The Germans abandoned their tanks, their artillery, their trucks. All that mattered was to escape westward, away from the white phantoms and steel beasts that had emerged from the blizzard. The road to Moscow, which they had traveled with such arrogance, became a graveyard of their ambitions, littered with shattered equipment and the frozen bodies of the invincible. The Blitzkrieg had died in the snow. The impact of Zhukov's counteroffensive was not measured merely in kilometers of territory regained or enemy divisions destroyed. Its most devastating blow was psychological. In less than a week, the myth of the Wehrmacht's invincibility, the foundational pillar upon which the entire edifice of the Third Reich rested, was shattered against a wall of snow and steel. For the individual German soldier, the universe had been turned upside down. The Übermensch, the Aryan conqueror destined to rule, suddenly found himself the prey. The hunter was now the hunted, pursued mercilessly across an alien and hostile landscape by an enemy he had despised as subhuman. Panic spread like a plague. Units that had maintained iron discipline through months of advance disintegrated. Officers lost control. The orderly retreat became a chaotic rout, a flight for individual survival. The cry, "The Russians are coming," echoed through the retreating columns, a phrase that embodied the primal terror of an army that saw itself on the brink of annihilation. The domino effect cascaded through the entire German command structure. Fedor von Bock, watching his army group disintegrate before his eyes, requested permission to conduct strategic withdrawals to establish a new defensive line. In Berlin, the news was met with disbelief, then with fury. Hitler, locked in his strategic delusion in the wolf's lair, could not comprehend the scale of the disaster. To him, it was a failure of will, not of logistics or enemy strategy. His response was drastic and brutal. He fired von Bock. He fired Guderian. He fired nearly 40 of his most experienced generals, the architects of the victories that had given him control of Europe. Assuming direct command of the army himself, he issued an order that would become infamous: halt befehl, not one step back. Hold positions at all costs. This order, while it probably prevented a total Napoleonic-style collapse of the Grande Armée, condemned hundreds of thousands of his men to a horrific death. Forced to remain in indefensible positions, without winter clothing, with scant ammunition and no hope of reinforcement, German soldiers died by the thousands. They died from Soviet artillery fire, from the bullets of Siberian snipers, and above all, they froze to death in their trenches, turned into frozen monuments to their leaders' madness. The news of the debacle before Moscow spread like wildfire across the entire Eastern Front. For the first time, German soldiers in Leningrad and Ukraine heard stories not of victories, but of a desperate retreat. The effect on morale was incalculable. The certainty of a quick victory evaporated, replaced by the grim realization that they were trapped in a war of attrition they could not win. Strategically, the failure to take Moscow was the turning point of the war. It forced Germany to winter in the Soviet Union, a prospect for which it was neither economically nor logistically prepared. The lightning war had failed. Now, Germany faced a total, protracted war against an enemy with seemingly inexhaustible human and material resources, while at the same time fighting the British Empire and, within days, the United States as well. The snowstorm Zhukov unleashed not only saved Moscow, it doomed the Third Reich. By January 1942, the momentum of the Soviet counteroffensive began to slow. Zhukov's own supply lines were now dangerously stretched, and his men, despite their victory, were exhausted. The front line stabilized hundreds of kilometers west of Moscow. The capital was safe. The existential threat had passed. The final statistics of the Battle of Moscow, from the start of Operation Typhoon in October to the conclusion of the counteroffensive in January, are of an almost incomprehensible scale. The Wehrmacht suffered over 500,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing, and captured. They lost more than 1,300 tanks and 2,500 artillery pieces. These were losses from which the German army would never fully recover. Soviet losses, as was typical on the Eastern Front, were even higher, far exceeding 1 million men. But the cruel arithmetic of attritional warfare favored the Soviet Union. They could absorb such losses and continue to generate new divisions. Germany could not. The legacy of the Battle of Moscow is monumental. It was here that the Blitzkrieg was dealt its death sentence. The strategy that had brought Poland, France, and most of Europe to their knees shattered against the strategic depth, fanatical resistance, and brutal brilliance of the Soviet command. It proved to the world, and to the Germans themselves, that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. Moscow was the beginning of the end. It was the turning point that transformed an apparent German victory into a long and bloody agony. The road that began in the snowy outskirts of the Soviet capital would lead inexorably to the ruins of Stalingrad, to the carnage of Kursk, and finally, to the bunker in Berlin. Georgy Zhukov was cemented as the savior of the Soviet Union. His reputation as Stalin's fireman, the man to be called upon in the darkest crises, was etched into history. His masterful use of strategic reserves and his impeccable timing of the counterattack would be studied in military academies for generations, and for the men who fought there, the Siberians who appeared like phantoms from the snow, the T-34 tankers who led the assault, and the defenders who clung to their city by their fingernails, the battle became legend. They became the symbol of a nation's resistance, the embodiment of an indomitable will that refused to break in the face of the most overwhelming adversity. The Wehrmacht had arrived at the gates of Moscow believing they were on the verge of history, and they were, but not as conquerors, but as witnesses to the moment the tide of the Second World War turned forever, swept away by a storm of snow and steel unleashed by the will of one man and the sacrifice of millions.